Welcome to New Mexico Black Rifle Operators Union. I'm your host, Sean. So, from request, I have a friend who listens to the podcast, was asking my take on single stage versus two-stage triggers. As people are building AR-15s from Christmas money they got, a lot of people think I'm some sort of gun guy. I guess I like guns a lot. And I know a lot about them, apparently. It's one of the things that's been a passion and a driver forever. But long story short, a single stage trigger is a consistent trigger pull until the gun goes off. A two-stage trigger pull is there's a little bit of a take-up. You hit a smooth wall, then it breaks, and then it's done. Then you can reset it. Now, what are they used for? Depends on what type of shooter you are, because I know precision shooters that use both types. I know shooters that are competitive shooters that use both types. So, if you're chasing split times, I would say a single stage is probably the way to go for everything. That's the really, really light, crisp trigger, meaning like 2-pound trigger pulls, those type of things. A two-stage trigger. Now, if you are a fan of military surplus rifles, like I am, specifically like the Mauser, the K98, or the Mosin Nagant, or the SMLE, the Enfields, or the M1 Grands, the M1 has a better trigger one than the Mauser, but the Mauser has what's commonly known back in the Gap as a military trigger pull. It is a two-stage trigger. And that's because of how it operates. Long story short, it's how the surfaces engage in the sear. The sear is actually what drops the hammer or the firing pin or the striker. And that's the part that how it interfaces with the trigger is what makes this a thing. So, in the long and the short of what I just said, you want a short, consistent trigger pull with a short, a light trigger weight. There we go. Or do you want a consistent pull, a little bit of take up to make sure you're right on target and that everything's just right, and then you squeeze the last little bit to set the gun off. Now, again, I've seen them used for both places. This is a 50-50 thing for me. I'm not a trigger snob. I'm the first one to admit that my triggers are consistent and when they break, that's it. I don't pay attention to where the take-up is or where the wall is very often unless it's a reset, and it's only on my Glock pistols that I worry about that. The AR-15s, the AKs I have, I've polished the triggers, and when I say polish them, I take the mating surfaces where the sear and the hammers engage, and I don't do anything special. I don't do anything major. I just take some light jeweler's file and some emery cloth, and I buff any impurities or any burrs or anything off. And then I polish it with some rouge and a stone or a polishing wheel. And that's all I ever do to a trigger. That's serviced me for everything I need. If you're wanting really good split times, if you're wanting, that's where the binary trigger comes in. A binary trigger, if you didn't know, is now kind of one of those things that the ATF's looking at more and more. They shouldn't, because it's not full auto. It doesn't meet their definition because during one single operation of the trigger, it only fires one round. It just so happens that as you pull and then release, it will fire on the pull and it will fire on the release. So this is a quick way to mimic full automatic fire. It's expensive. It's a cool trick. It's a cool toy. I would like to have one for my MP5. I don't have one. It's not a big deal for me. They're not high on my list of what's cool. As far as high-end triggers, if I was building a marksman's rifle, which I already have one, but if I was building one with a special trigger, it'd probably be a 2-stage trigger for that. And that's because that's what I've trained on for long-range shooting at Infinitum. My first long-range rifle that I used, and people will laugh, but it is very capable of long-range, is a German K98 Mauser. Now, if you put a good scope on it, back in the day, I had a scope on mine. It was Simmons because that was considered medium end back then. Now it would be considered very low end. But the glass was decent, and I could consistently make shots 300 and 600 yards all day with that rifle. Fast forward a little bit, I turned it into an 8mm .6 to get a little more ass behind that heavy ass 8mm bullet, or 323 bullet. And I turned it into an 8mm .6. It was better. It's now, I have two of them. I have my dad's and I have my own. You take a K98, you remount the chamber to an .6, but you keep the bullet the same. So what you end up with back in the Gap, they'd call this a poor man's Magnum. Now my rifles, I can tell you they're amazing. I've found elk and deer with them, but that's not what I'm talking about. None of them have special triggers. Well, Dad's does. Dad put a Timney trigger in it, and it has adjustable settings on it. And Dad adjusted it to his liking, and I have no problems with the trigger that Dad had set up for his. So I'm not going to change it because I'm not a trigger snob. But if you're building the ultimate, the greatest, the best rifle that you could possibly make for the money, do your research on what kind of triggers you like. I hope this is part of that. But check out someone like Mike at Mr. Guns and Gears. He talks about that stuff all the time. Tim at Military Arms does too, to some extent, but James Reeves will tell you some shortcuts on the AR platform that they have that actually make a lot of sense for cost. So you can do a trigger job yourself, or you can pay Geissele and buy their equipment and their trigger for your rifle if you're using a modern rifle. That's on you. You decide. I usually don't modify carry guns because I don't want that ever to be brought up in court. I know the odds on that are really slim, but it's still one of those things that has been in case law that I don't want to try to fight against. When you modify a gun, in my opinion, you modified it for a set purpose. A trigger is usually set to improve your accuracy, and if you tend to not have a problem with accuracy, meaning you take your time, you train, you build your loads for whatever gun you're using, you know everything you can about the load, how it interacts with the mating surfaces in the chamber and the bore and the whole bit, so that you know what it's going to do downrange. And then you have the chronograph data, all that stuff. I have that for like my 308s. For the 9mm, if it can hit 4 inches, I consider that golden. 4 inches at the head, 4 inches in the chest, 4 inches in a shoulder, 4 inches in the thigh, 4 inches in the pelvis. That pretty much will get you where you need to go with a pistol. That's how I see it. That's not how I've been trained. Accuracy matters, but also so does shot placement. That's accuracy. But shot displacement, like meaning that you're hitting in multiple places, matters too, because then you're starting to cause more bleed out. With a deer or you're hunting, that type of thing, less is more. I say that all the time with anything I shoot. If I have to ever use a defensive pistol or a defensive rifle, I hope I only ever have to use one round. But odds are, in a gunfight, you're probably going to fire more than one round. And I say that because it doesn't matter how accurate you are. There's going to be a pressure differential that happens with your anxiety and your training level and the fact that all this stuff is happening at once. So that's what I would recommend you do. Do your research. There's different, if you're looking for a modern rifle, like an AR-15 or an AR-10, they make different types of triggers. Some of them are just direct replacements. They use different springs, maybe to give it a little bit more tension here or there. Geisley's good at that. They make a very good price right version for theirs. There's also cassette manufacturers. When I say cassette, these are drop-ins. They're self-contained. It's like what you'd find on What Would Stoner Do builds or modern iterations of it. And this is kind of what Dad has on his 8mm .6, or had on his 8mm .6 that I have now. So there's a rundown on triggers. Good or bad, I can't tell you, other than those are what I know about what it is. Make the decision for yourself. And if you really, really are concerned about it, find a friend that has one. Because that is what I can tell you for all 2A accessories. If you like it, then buy it. I say that, but living in Northwest New Mexico, we don't always get the option to try things. I've tried a lot of triggers because I've got to shoot a lot of different guns from a lot of different owners. Taking friends to the range tends to do that. And some of us have different budgets. You know, I had a friend who barely had enough money for the rifle, and I had a spare optic and I gave it to him. That type of thing. You see what I'm saying? So the trigger thing, when you, like, I have 2 or 3 friends that are really high-end collectors that probably have something with that type of trigger that if I make a call, I could probably go out and try it. I've tried high-end AR-15 triggers. I'm not a fan of the straight triggers. I like the curved shoe. But again, your firearm should reflect the user, not me. It should have an intended purpose, just like Nothing Fancy used to say. What's its intended uses or use case or whatever. That's what we'd say in IT. If you're looking to build the best of the best, do your research and find out what you consider the best. Sometimes an uber light trigger is a bad thing, is a safety concern. Sometimes a really hard, long trigger, like an HK trigger, is a good thing. And I don't say that lightly. Like an MP5 basically has the same trigger pack as a G3 rifle. They aren't known for their great trigger pulls. But the MP5 has that accuracy for a 9mm that make up for anything you would ever think about with the trigger. Like, share, subscribe, be great.